Hi, friends, fellow evolvers, and curious people everywhere. I'm Sally Wilson, and I have the great pleasure of speaking with our wonderful guest today, Michael Bradshaw. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, Sally. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It was such a joy to meet Michael, listeners and viewers, when we were both working at the Cuskelly School of Music Winter School. And so Michael is a music educator and also a conductor and various other things as well, which I'm sure we'll get to during the course of this conversation. Um, but one of the things you do, Michael, is teach at the Sydney Conservatorium. Is it high school?
Yes, that's right, the high school. So
Yep.
it's sort of the underground basement area of Sydney Con that nobody regularly gets to see.
And so you're teaching year 7 up to year 12 music, is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
So one of the things that I'm fascinated by is it's actually related to a conversation we had when we were at the Cuskelly School College of Music, is how you work with teenagers. Because I know that a lot of people find it very challenging. I know that the teenagers who you're working with are at the Conservatorium High School because they want to be here and they love be there and they love music. But can you just give us some insight as to how you particularly work with teenagers, since you do so much of it?
Yeah, and I do absolutely love it. And certainly it's something I've always thought that I'd really like working with teenagers. In fact, it was during my first year of university when I was doing some traveling overseas with my old school to Japan, and we visited a school in Japan, and I grew up in Japan. I know we'll talk about that a bit later, but we visited a school in Japan that was a music specialist school, as well as doing other subjects, and I just thought, oh, this is what I want to do. So I've always been drawn to that age group, and I guess any techniques with working with teenagers that I've picked up have been largely due to mentors that I've had. But I think that the real guiding philosophy for me is one is, and this is nothing new to those who are listeners who are educators, but to be interested in them. They are super switched on to the adult world, because I think they're merging into that adult world, and even though they have this love-hate relationship, they don't want adults around them, but they also need adults around them. So, and they're wanting to enter that world. So I think when an adult is genuinely interested in the young person, then that's a really powerful thing for them. And then the other thing I guess that I've always got in mind is that constant tiptoeing between being. Let me just make sure that if that was my sound, then I will turn that off. But the tiptoeing that we do, that balance between wanting to be interested in them, caring about them, but when we're not their friends either. And actually, those boundaries, the clearer we draw them in a very warm way and very respectful way, they actually they need that, and they feel safer once those boundaries are drawn.
And so, how do you draw those boundaries?
I think it's sometimes it's just purely the way in which you do things, and of course, the schools legislate these things, so you're obviously not, texting them or doing the sort of things that friends would do, social media. At my school, we do use surnames. I think that's just a way of it. You don't have to do that, but it's a symbolic gesture of saying we're at different sort of different stages of our lives. We have different roles, so it's hard to sort of put a finger on it. I think largely there's opportunities that pop up. So if a student maybe hasn't done something that they needed to do, or they're wanting you to make a special exception, sometimes just having to go, no, we can't do that, and these are the reasons. And they might plead to you, sort of appeal to the friendship, but that's not how it works. And even though
Mm.
at the time they might not like you for that, that's over time it's drawing those boundaries. In fact, that's probably the best way to sum it up. Don't care whether they like you or not.
Yeah, that's a big
Whereas
one, isn't it?
if you're a friend, you probably do care that they like you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I find it interesting that it was when you were on a school trip and you went to that music specialist school, you thought, ah, this is what I want to do. What was it that appealed to you?
Um, well, music was always a really big part of my life, especially from yeah, around probably around year five, what would be in Australia year five, and it's something just clicked, and I really wanted to. In fact, when it clicked, it was a twofold thing. So mathematics clicked for me, and music clicked for me, and so it probably was just some developmental thing that happened. And ever since then, I just couldn't stop doing music, and I I remember those teenage years. It's emotionally a very lots of strong emotions and confusion that can happen, but music always was something that made me feel grounded. Um, in my case, it was largely making music on my own, although now I'm much more gravitate towards making it with others. But I think I just, at that age group, when I am able to work with young people who also are drawn to music, whatever the styles or instruments they're playing, it reminds me of what a special time that was, a hard time, but a special time. And
Mm.
the people in my life who brought music into my life, still in my mind, are the people that are really dear to me. So if I could be that sort of person to a few of the students, then I'd feel very like a purpose has been served in my life.
It's interesting you should say that. I was just thinking back to some of the music teachers I've had, and I'm still in touch with the music teacher I had in primary school and in secondary school. Two music teachers there, and you're right. They're people who we had something in common in that we were drawn to music, and that was sort of the foundation for what became the friendship. You're right. They weren't friendships when I was actually a student. But there's something that you said that really stood out to me in a conversation we had when we were both working at the Cuskelly College. Um, and it's that you set the bar for teenagers. Um, and they often fail to meet it, but you have to set the bar, you have to set expectations. And I think that the interplay with that is that they are emerging adults. They're not yet adults, but they are, you use the term emerging adults. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So one writer that I actually found incredibly meaningful and quite touching in the way that he writes regarding it's called classroom management. The writer's Bill Rogers, but he says he actually says target the emerging adult. So I owe that phrase to his writing. But I think it's again this thing that they want to become adults, and if you don't set the bar high, they'll get this sense that you don't really respect them. So they like you to have the bar set high, but at the same time they are kids. Their brains are not quite yet organized, so they will forget things. They will fail to meet those expectations. And when that happens, I think you have to clearly say to them, give them feedback and say, look, you didn't meet that expectation. But that has to be presented in a way where you immediately say, but I absolutely believe you can meet that expectation. And how can we work together to get there? Let's try again.
Mm.
In fact, just today, a student of mine who's doing a sing and play task, which is where she's got to play the piano while singing, and at one point we sort of had 3 minutes after class to sort of workshop a little something, and she said, "Oh, Dr. Bradshaw, I think your expectations are too high for me." And I said, No, my expectations aren't too high. We just need to break it down a bit more. Maybe you
Mm,
need it broken down into a few more steps."
mm.
And I think it's really important at that age, for them to feel that somebody believes in you. And I don't mean that in the airy fairy, "Oh, I believe in you, you're such a good person," but actually set the bar really high
Yeah.
and say, I think you can achieve this.
Yeah. That's a wonderful point, actually. Setting the bar high, having somebody really believe in you, um, in that kind of supportive way, as opposed to the kind of pressure that some people grow up with, which is you have to be perfect in order to be acceptable. You're never enough. There's something wrong with you if you make mistakes. Um, do you have many students who deal with that kind of pressure they put on themselves? And how do you deal with that, if so?
Yes, certainly. There's a lot of pressure that they put on themselves. I think also the pressure that they put on themselves is that's learnt pressure, and they've got models of that sort of pressure, and sometimes that is families as well. I think the parents want the best for their young ones, and that can sometimes manifest in pressure. So. Um, Sometimes we talk about, I think, acceptance and awareness of one's own character. So certainly at the school, being a whole bunch of musicians, we do have a few of the neurotic type, somewhat obsessive, and I think what I try and say to them is, you are who you are. That doesn't mean you have to give up on changing yourself. But if, for example, you have a bit of a obsessive or perfectionist streak to your personality, to point out to them, well, we talk about those as negative things, but is that ever good? Has that ever helped you? And they go, "Oh, yeah, well, it helps me practice. I really like practicing. And not many of my other friends could sustain 2 or 3 hours of practice every day." And I said, well, yes. And when is it a downside? Or when I get a bit caught up in it. So I often say to them, well, actually, it's not about saying I'm a perfectionist, that's bad, I need to suppress that, but rather going, these are some of my character traits,
Mm,
or my character strengths, but there's a flip side to those, and my job is not to suppress who I am, but learn strategies to maximize the positives in my character. Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Perfectionism. I was a perfectionist, Michael, when I was a student and then early on in my career. And it wasn't until I had a teacher, a singing teacher, who said to me, I don't even remember her exact words, but she helped me to understand that being a perfectionist and putting that kind of pressure on myself was holding me back. And that
Mm.
was such a light bulb moment. And that was the beginning of my being able to let it go. And later on, I did some work in really letting it go on a very deep level, on a subconscious level, because if we pick up those things when we're little, um, they become part of our wiring. And it's interesting that you also mentioned that as part, those things can be a part of our personality, but it's also, I think, important to recognize that our personalities are malleable,
Yes.
and they're often ideas we've simply picked up about ourselves to begin with from other people as we're growing up. And some of them are great and some of them are not. And that's even if we've had a great childhood, you know.
Yes.
So, so
Yes.
I'm, yeah, yeah. But I'm also wondering what the influence. So as you say, you grew up in Japan, and so you suffered quite a culture shock when you moved back to Australia when you were 14, I think.
Yes, yes, that's right. Sort of just about turning 15.
That's an interesting time to change countries, and because Japanese was also your first language, right?
Certainly in terms of a dominant language, I always grew up speaking English, so English was what I spoke first, but I learned to read and write in Japanese
Mm.
earlier than I did in English.
And so, how did you cope with that? transition, as a 14, 15-year-old, moving countries, schools, finding a new friendship group, all of that stuff at a time when we're all kind of trying to find ourselves anyway. That was a big double whammy. How did you negotiate that? And from that, how do you think it's influenced how you work with young people now?
Yeah. I think in retrospect, I probably didn't manage it overly well. It certainly was a shock. And obviously at that age, the social side of things are so important. I was pretty socially awkward to start with, but the moving countries certainly compounded that. I'm Caucasian and I look very, very much, well, I do not look Japanese, let's put it that way. So when I came to Australia and I speak with a bit of a British accent that I picked up from parents while in Japan, and obviously the last thing that I look and sound like is Japanese. And I became very aware of how inside I thought I was Japanese, I identified as Japanese. But in Australia, I was treated like this person who spoke with a bit of a Pommy accent, anything but Japanese. And I remember thinking, oh, gosh, I wish I just looked Japanese because then people treat me like the way that I feel. I did find music was the space where I really found friends. So there was a wonderful choir program at where I was, and I felt very much at home. But apart from that, I think I largely sort of withdrew. Piano became a very, very significant part of my life, and that it took on an element of escapism, which then later I did have to undo a bit because that was an unhealthy association or role for music to take on. And I only really feel like music became a properly happy place and joyful place for me once it again became a social thing with the students that I work with. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that quite answers your question, but yeah, huge culture shocks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, that experience of feeling like you're one thing on the inside and something else on the outside. I think, a lot of teenagers don't, and I say we, because, we've all been teenagers if we're older than teenagehood. At some point in our life, we feel like we're feeling certain things on the inside that either can't be expressed or we don't know how to express them. Or, I mean, I remember sort of the flip side of that when I first went overseas and feeling like I could absolutely recreate myself because no one knew me here. What liberation, you know? Is that something? I'm just wondering because I know that you also went to Hungary to study music. Is this in your sort of early or mid-20s you went there?
Yes, it would have been mid-20s.
Yeah, yeah. Did that experience kind of come to life for you then?
Yes, definitely. Even when I was younger, my parents did move around a little bit. Apparently, my mum tells me this story of apparently when I went into year 7 and it was a new school, and I said to my mum, "Oh, it's really important because now I can create the Michael that I want." And I think, yes, we are aware that each time we move to a new place, because the people around us reflect and reinforce our own impressions of ourselves, and that how we initially present ourselves to people, the way in which we relate to others, then reflects back to us. And as you were saying earlier, Sally, we are malleable as people. So yes, I think every new place that we go to, when we surround ourselves with new people, especially if it's a radical change where perhaps you are completely surrounded by new people.
Yeah.
Rather than, for example, you're with family and friends in the city, but you've changed jobs. So you've got some new people, some older friendships. I
Mm.
think that, yes, it does allow you to discover parts of yourself in a new way.
Yeah. And so why did you go to Hungary?
Um, so when I was doing my undergraduate studies, and my focus was piano performance, but also musicology, with particular emphasis on music analysis. Um, at that stage, I was thinking I'd love to become an academic. That earlier dream that I spoke of about maybe working at a high school, that was a little bit in the background. Um, I had earlier in my undergraduate degree been taught by Dr. James Cuskelly, who I know you've interviewed on this program. And certainly he inspired me to pursue more education, but then he left the university, and I got a little bit more caught up in the academic side of things. But then there was a chance encounter at a Thai laksa place when I met James Cuskelly again, and he was sort of nudged me, as he often does, sort of saying, "Now, what are you doing about this? You've got a passion for this area. How are you pursuing it?"
Mhm.
And 8 months later, I found myself in Hungary because that is where the Kodai approach many people as almost a sort of quasi pilgrimage. They go there to
Mm.
study the Kodai approach. Um, and it's a fantastic program where we study not only the pedagogy of teaching music, but also we get weekly piano lessons, weekly singing lessons, weekly conducting lessons, music history, learning from amazing Hungarian specialists about Hungarian music. And so it just was a fantastic
Mm.
opportunity that I was very lucky to do for 2 years.
And what is I might be asking you to, describe the impossible in a nutshell. What is, the difference between the way, um, the Kadai music philosophy approaches music and music education, as opposed to the way music is generally taught in Australia?
Yes. I mean, I think there's many, many ways in which music is taught in Australia. Probably one of the most fundamental aspects of the Kodai philosophy is that it's active music making. That first and foremost, we learn about music through music. So it's participation. Um, and that when we label things, so calling a scale a particular scale or analyzing a chord, that what's most important for students is that they've had an experience to which they can attach that label, and that that's the way to bring joyful music learning to
Mm,
young people.
mm,
That if it's an abstract exercise of here's your tonic, and then if you go 3 notes up on the white keyboard, then you've got your third, and then you've got your fifth. If that's your first classroom introduction to music, you're not going to catch the spark of
mm,
young people, and all young people have that musical spark.
mm,
So, whereas if your first experience is let's sing a song together, and you're making music, then the spark's there. So I think the Kodai approach essentially is always at the heart of it, it's making music. We do a lot of that through the voice because that's a very accessible instrument. Everybody has it. And then once they've got those experiences, we start adding concepts and all of that through a carefully structured approach or
mm,
sequential approach.
mm. I'm glad you said that. Everyone's got a voice. I hear so many people say, "I can't sing, I can't sing, I can't sing." Well, that's an idea you picked up. There's no truth to that. There's
No.
no truth to it. And when one of my favorite things at the winter school when we were there, Michael, I participated in a singing games session.
Yes.
And there were kids from 5 to people who I would say probably 65 or so in that um, session, and we all had so much fun, and we were all able to play these singing games together. It just blew me away. There was so much hilarity, And I think, and that's, um, I believe, inspired by the Kadai approach, is it?
Yes, absolutely. Most fundamental thing, there's a quote from Kodai which says we need to teach music in a way that makes it a joy to learn rather than a torture. And it sounds pretty simple, but people, educators will dedicate their lives to how to make that something that can apply to all of their students. So music is for all, and it should be a joy for all.
Yep.
So absolutely, yes, that's very much part of it. And interestingly, I think often if you ask, especially the younger students, what were you doing? They might not necessarily say, "Oh, we were singing." They say, "Oh, we were just playing games." It's almost
Yeah.
like, "Oh, what? We were singing then? Oh, I didn't realize that." It's just this natural expression of humanity
Yep.
that is singing, rather than compartmentalizing it into some activity that is something different.
Yeah. You know, the only memory I have now of my great grandmother was of her singing me this song. And I only have a fragment of it.
Yeah.
But it's such a beautiful memory that music, it stays with you.
Yes.
Um, and what, so is it very obvious to you how that experience in Hungary um, informs your teaching of music now, particularly in an institution where I suppose, I mean, I'm assuming that the Kadai approach is not used by everybody in the Conservatorium High School. How do you find, even in, Australian institutions, your teaching tends to differ perhaps because of your experience there?
Um, I think definitely uh, I try as much as possible to hold myself accountable to that standard of only teach something that they've performed or that they've embodied. Uh,
Mm,
and that can be quite tricky, especially as we're going into senior years and they're having to grasp concepts uh, that are maybe a little bit more complex.
mm,
One thing that I did pick up from in Hungary was there were quite a few lecturers who just loved music and lived music, and they were constantly. I think sometimes the Kodai approach is thought of as you learn the steps, your sequence. You need to teach this song here, and then you've taught it, which is quite a rigid concept of any kind of pedagogy. It's not really a living pedagogy.
mm,
Um, uh, but what I saw a few of the lecturers do was they'd sit with a score with both their musical hat on, but also their educator's hat, and they'd see teaching possibilities, whether it's they'd hear a little part of it and go, "Oh, that's a really good chord progression. Maybe I can get the students to play that on the piano,
mm,
change it into a few different keys." And then half the group could sing the melody against that, or maybe grab their instrument out, play that melody, and then that little part that follows we could do as a little dictation. So I realized that a good educator almost can't take that hat off. Once you put it
mm,
on, it's always there. When you listen to a piece of music, whether it's in the concert hall or a pop song on the radio, part of you is going, what activities, performance activities could the students do that would lead them into enjoyment of the piece?
mm.
So I think maybe that's one thing that I do that perhaps not all educators would do, but there certainly are a lot that do that and think that way.
Yeah. And as you say, music is for everyone,
Yes.
whether or not we've, had the opportunity to have music lessons or learn to read music. Um, I'd love to hear about how you feel. It might be difficult to answer this question in terms of your personal experience because it's so close to you, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Um, how do you feel music and being a musician, learning and experiencing music has influenced the other areas of your life, the other things that you've studied? Because I know you've studied mathematics.
Mm.
And also as a music educator, how do you see the benefits of music education in your students' sort of other various areas of their education or their lives?
Yeah. Um, it's I think it's true when you're lucky enough to have music as your profession, through performance, through teaching, um, you can sometimes lose touch with how significant music actually is. Uh, I'm lucky to also work with a community choir where there's a lot of people who don't study music. It's not their profession. And the raw passion and the honest passion that they have for music, it often reminds me of how special that music is. And sure, they're not as well trained. They might not read music. They might not be as technically accomplished as somebody who's done many years of training, but the passion is absolutely gold. It is the thing. So I think that passion is probably at the center of musicians' lives. With the way that I think that impacts the teaching. I think my wish for all of the students is, even if music isn't perhaps what they do, they should never forget that feeling of engaging in something passionately and something that absorbs them. Of course, the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow, being in flow. And it's something that we now know is part of a human experience, very much linked to well-being. Whether you're in a state of flow, and that's when you have a challenge that matches your ability. So I think if we've had music in our lives and it's been something that's given us joy, that means we've experienced flow. And once you've had a taste of that, it's hard to settle for anything less. It's hard to settle for a mediocre job where you don't feel like you've got a sense of purpose. You don't feel like it's challenging you. So I think that's what I hope students take away from it.
Yeah.
I've probably completely gone off answering two questions that you asked. So please feel free to ask them again. Put me back on track, Sally.
Well, actually, this takes me off onto a whole other sort of.
Mathematics, that's right. You asked about mathematics. Yes. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just, in hearing you talk about that, I remember an Australian politician, Paul Keating,
Yes.
and I'm going to completely paraphrase this. So forgive me if anyone really knows politics and can remember this moment where Paul Keating, he alluded to the fact that a lot of politicians have never experienced the value of arts, including music, and what it can do for you. And so in never having the experience, they can't value it as in the same way as someone who has. And I know that Paul Keating certainly valued the arts very highly, but he'd had that personal experience of it. And that's just very much aligned with what you're saying, in flow. Or I remember my first memory of, I would describe it as almost like a high from music, was the primary school choir when we sang harmony. It was this magical experience. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, with Mrs. Ruth Gilmore. She was our choir teacher, and it's the most extraordinary experience. And if people are listening to this thinking, oh, gee, I'd like to experience that, well, find a community choir. And it doesn't matter if it's a community choir. It doesn't matter whether you can read music or not. And I know that that's certainly a fear that a lot of people have, is, well, I can't read music, I can't sing. The second is a fallacy. But it doesn't need to stop you from having this experience or prevent you from having this experience. But back to mathematics. Because a lot of people, you hear it sort of, articles in the newspaper every now and again, and talked about every now and again, the links between music and mathematics. And I know that a lot of people have this idea. I've had it said to me, well, oh, you're a musician, you must be really good at maths. Well, I wouldn't say I am particularly. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because you have studied both,
Yeah.
Michael.
Yes, I did. In the first 2 years, I loved mathematics at school, and as I said earlier, sort of mathematics and music were the two things that seemed to click at roughly the same time, maybe sometime during year 6 for me, and both were really significant. And I studied during the first 2 years of my undergraduate studies. I also studied mathematics before focusing on music. I think probably it was the flow aspect of it. I mean, taking a step back to links between music and mathematics, last I read sort of the psychological literature, which is a little while ago, and I'm not trained as a psychologist, but it's very difficult to make a causational link between those. Partly because we don't quite know how they would overlap, but also there's plenty of counterexamples of brilliant musicians who you mention the word mathematics and they just shudder.
Yeah.
So I don't. It's definitely not the case that you have to be good at one to be good at the other, or that by being good at one you're going to be good at the other. But what I do think is that mathematics, and to people who maybe don't enjoy mathematics, this might be an odd thing to say, but there's a beauty in it when a solution emerges. That is, often mathematicians will say that's a beautiful solution because the logic lines up and there's almost a rhythm to the thinking. So I think what drew me to mathematics was it was a world that was contained. It was made up of axioms, of your sort of a priori bits of information, and you say, if this is true and this is true, then this has to be true, and then following this logic. So it was like building your own world that you were in control of, and that you could get lost in. And I think that's similar in some ways to what musicians can experience. But some students I've had that hate mathematics, they are also brilliant painters, and they say it's the same thing, this getting into flow, time almost stopping, losing your awareness of time, and just feeling this high from engaging in something. So I think maybe often musicians also have another area where they are able to enter that sense of heightened flow. And it seems like often it is mathematics. I've had quite a few students who love chess. I hate chess. I can't stand it because it's one of the few games where you can't blame it on luck if you lose. So I can't stand it, and I always lose.
I love how you also, you used what I think of as a musical term when you were talking about maths in the rhythm of the thought process. And you've given me a little bit more of an insight as to what mathematics can do. You may well have inspired people to both music and mathematics here, Michael. Just to sort of round up, for people who are out there thinking, oh, gee, I think I would like to experience that. Are there any thoughts you would like them to hear, just in summing up? And I'm thinking particularly around music, even though so many things came into this conversation, but particularly around music, Michael.
Yeah, the earlier reference you made to Paul Keating, I know that I've also seen that on YouTube, a wonderful resource for all things true and not so true. But I think people, if you had watched that, and I do admire Paul Keating. I won't give my political stripes too much, but I think if you didn't have that experience as a young person, the way that maybe Paul Keating put that, and listeners can go and watch it, I encourage it, but it might come across as a bit condescending. And I think people should never feel ashamed or somehow that they're lacking in intelligence if they haven't necessarily been touched by the arts, because it is not at all the case that only the so-called high arts, like classical music, can touch people and give people that experience. Any genre, provided it's got a rich enough culture of practitioners, will have its own whole world where you can slowly enter into it, become a participator. So I think the first thing would be whatever your artistic or your latent artistic interest is. So if you're listening to something and you go, oh, I kind of like this, but is that the right thing to like? I think never worry about, is it the right thing? Just trust that whatever aesthetic is drawing you in that direction, that's worth pursuing. It might be that you maybe start off with that Elvis Presley, that it's something, maybe it's the moves of those legs that just get you going and you think, this is my music. It might be that 2 years down the track, you realize, oh, he does kind of use the same harmonic progression every single time. And then I think there's just a natural progression where you might go, no, I'm ready to explore something else.
Yeah.
But never feel like whatever's drawing you to an art, and this could be music or anything, is not valuable or is not genuine and beautiful in some way. So I think that's don't let anybody ever tell you that our music theatre, that's not a real art. In real life, people don't break out into song. I think I just saw a quote recently. If you say you don't like music theatre because in real life nobody breaks out into song, you should say to them, well, you don't hang around the right people.
Such an important point to make, Michael. And even I think so many of us also have been brought up to think that it's only worth doing things that we're really good at. Well, being good at something is a judgment too. And the arts are there to enjoy. We don't need to judge how good or bad we are at them. I mean, if we're just doing it to enjoy it, that's a good enough reason. That's a more than good enough reason to do it.
Yes. In fact, one little thing that's popped into mind as well, I mean, it's fantastic working with teenagers because they still have that young innocence that means they throw curveball questions at you. And I think as a throwaway mark, I said to a student, this was just the other day, I'll just make sure you don't become a boring adult. And they looked at me and said, are you a boring adult? Oh, well, what is a boring adult? And it made me think, I think that we adults throughout our lives, we need to become expert at things, whether it's our profession or the relationships that we have with people. And the more expert we become in our little niche area, the more uncomfortable it is to step outside of that, because that means taking a step back into that world of a beginner, the insecurity. And I think that's essentially one way we could describe why are adults boring. It's because we've got those well-trodden paths that we're comfortable in, and that we need to be comfortable in because we're responsible, we've got careers, we need to be able to do things quickly and efficiently. But we also need to step outside those areas in order to be youthful and be full of life at all times as well.
Michael Bradshaw, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Pleasure, me too.
And listeners and watchers, I will post some relevant links in the copy of this chat so that you can look some things up, like the Kadai Institute, things like that. But thank you also for joining us and for being a part of this conversation. And I'll look forward to seeing you and speaking with you over the waves next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.